All right. Well, it is 1 o'clock and we've still got folks joining us and they'll still be able to join us. But let's go ahead and jump right into this. First, I want to welcome everyone to our first Brownfield Redevelopment webinar in our new series. My name is Shane Barton. I work for the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky, and I am our Downtown Revitalization Coordinator. And as we get into this presentation and webinar today, you'll start to see the connection between my interest in downtown revitalization and the Brownfield program. But this is our new monthly webinar series that we're going to be focused on Brownfield redevelopment and downtown revitalization here in Kentucky. This series over time is going to feature a variety of presentations and panels, really intended to help attendees learn more about the resources that are available for Brownfield redevelopment and downtown revitalization broadly. These webinars are really intended to connect communities throughout the Commonwealth with resources, technical assistance, new funding opportunities, and inspirational stories of successful brownfield development efforts throughout Kentucky. And this series is really one of many new opportunities planned as a part of our new partnership between SEDC and the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet for Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet's Department of Environmental Protection Brownfield program. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So today's webinar really is our first, like I said, and this webinar really is around Brownfields for beginners. And we've got two great staff members from the state office joining us today. But before we jump into some introductions, I just want to do a quick brief outline of what we're going to cover today. So you're going to hear from the Brownfield program staff. We're going to talk about the history of the program, the Brownfield program in general. We're going to define what a brownfield is. We're going to talk about the redevelopment benefits of brownfields and downtown revitalization. We're going to touch on the stakeholders that are involved and dive into the redevelopment process. And then we're going to wrap up sort of sharing some available funding and technical assistance opportunities. But before we get into all of this, I want to introduce the Brownfield program staff and allow them to introduce themselves. With us today, we have Lynn True, the Kentucky Brownfield Coordinator, and Kiersten O'Leary, the Kentucky Brownfield Outreach and Education Specialist. So I'm going to invite Lynn and Kiersten to join here and introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. This is Lynn, and thank you for having us. We're excited to partner with your organization and help get the word out about brownfields. In the state program, my role is to support local officials and community leaders in their efforts to clean up and redevelop properties. And these are properties that either have contamination, they are known to have contamination, or they are perhaps only suspected to have contamination. Specifically in this role, I oversee the Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program. And by that, I mean I help communities identify and assess brownfields so that they can make more informed decisions. I also oversee our Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, which helps communities finance cleanup projects. And in addition to these functions, I help promote the program along with our education and outreach coordinator, Kiersten O'Leary. Kiersten will further explain some of those activities and her role with the program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kiersten O'Leary. Shane, I just want to let you know, we are not able to start our videos. It looks like it says the host has stopped our ability to share our videos. So I can continue on while you try to look at that maybe. But anyway, I've been with the Brownfield program for about 1.5 years now, so I'm relatively new. But I've started out with a focus on education and outreach, doing a lot of things to help communities leverage resources and explore funding opportunities. Also help communities, conduct grant writing workshops and kind of our general outreach events, just focus on, what are brownfields, very similar to, events like we're doing today. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, this is our first webinar, so we're sort of ironing out some technical details. Kiersten and Lynn, I think I have allowed you to share your videos. At least I clicked on that function. I hope it will allow you. There we go.
There we go.
I see your face. Perfect. Sorry about that. I
No, you're
didn't know
good.
I needed to click that button, but I appreciate it. Thanks for letting me know. So let's jump right in really with some background. And I'm going to turn this over to Lynn to sort of share really the story of the Brownfield program from its inception and why it exists today.
Sure. So brownfields are basically a result of past activities that may have led to environmental contamination. While some of these sites date back to the early 1900s, of course, this was at a time when our society was becoming more industrialized, but at the same time, we didn't have regulations to kind of keep these activities in check to prevent pollution. So yeah, a lot of these sites do date back to the early 1900s. These are just industrial properties or commercial properties that had various uses for activities that created contamination issues. However, some brownfield sites are more recent and are caused by recent spills or recent activities that contaminated that property. And in fact, some brownfields may not even have contamination. So a brownfield site is not necessarily a contaminated piece of property. It may just simply be a blighted property that has deteriorated because of the perception of contamination at that site. And we'll get into that a little more detail later. But regardless, these sites exist because potential buyers, developers are reluctant to purchase and redevelop them due to their environmental concerns. To help get these properties back into protective use, EPA began some brownfield projects to help promote redevelopment back in the early 1990s. And then in the early 2000s, there were several laws that were passed to actually get programs established that would provide financial and technical assistance to help get these properties back up and going. So that is really kind of the background for what these properties are and why they are a problem and why, unfortunately, local governments tend to shoulder most of the burden of these types of sites.
Thank you, Lynn. Excuse me, I jumped a slide. Before I get into this, I do want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box. You should see that on your side as an attendee. If you don't see that, feel free to add those to the chat. We will circle back to those at the end of the webinar and try to go through and address all of the questions that are there as best as we can. But, leading out of sort of what Lynn shared about the history of development, I want to try to draw a connection to sort of our interest in downtown revitalization. And as you all know, downtowns often are places where we have concentrated development, historical development. And those communities of concentration often have the most iconic and powerful anchors, the things that remind us of who our community and what our community represents. But we're also all too familiar with that elephant on Main Street, right? That abandoned or vacant or derelict or dilapidated, underutilized, idled or neglected building that really represents our downtowns and our communities in ways that we don't really want them to represent us for a variety of reasons, whether they may be potentially contaminated or just abandoned and blighted. But these properties do carry a substantial number of barriers for redevelopment. And they are even more exacerbated when they are considered brownfields, in particular if there's perceived contamination or risks associated with the redevelopment. But the thing that I want to remind us is that these opportunities around buildings and these sites really are a wonderful thing that we can utilize and leverage to start having some great conversations in our communities. There are wonderful things to bring people together, to start thinking about what our community vision is, what our priorities are, how we can engage philanthropic efforts or organizations, or even try to leverage private investment or public-private partnerships. When we can start to move some of these buildings forward to get them investment ready or competitive, it really allows us to do some amazing things that we're going to hear about a little bit later. But the thing that I want to remind you is that there are a number of opportunities, both formal programs and technical assistance that we're going to share related specifically to brownfields that we hope can help you think about ways to move your downtown revitalization efforts forward. But let's touch a little bit on the negative impacts of some of those buildings, right? When they become sort of derelict or blighted, simply defined as when the previously functioning element fell or falls into disrepair, we know that it impacts our communities. It demoralizes communities. It decreases quality of life. We know that abandoned buildings often attract nefarious activities, and that many fires in vacant structures are caused by arson or suspected arson. And in particular, when we're worried about sort of the health and safety of our emergency medical personnel, structure fires in abandoned buildings are incredibly dangerous. But these buildings can also pose environmental or health safety hazards. They decrease property values. They reduce the tax revenues because they've depreciated those property values. And they often slow economic development. They detract from potential entrepreneurs and developers. One of the things that we often hear from our state officials and even county officials when they are trying to attract new investments from businesses or private investments, those investors often travel and visit town. They come to your community. And if they see a number of buildings that are boarded up, vacant, derelict, half burned down, it really gives them a bad taste and a bad first impression for what that community values and where they have begun to put their money and investment. So just a reminder that these buildings not only are opportunities, but when we think about the sort of negative impact that exists with them, they are great moments for us to really make some impressive changes. But one of the reasons that this is so important right now is the new bipartisan infrastructure law that was recently passed. And this new law is providing really historic levels of funding, not just for the EPA Brownfields program, but for a number of other programs that can be connected with the Brownfield program. And the thing that I really want to emphasize here is that with this new funding stream, there really is an increased focus on community-led revitalization efforts. So when we think about the sort of power of community engagement and community vision, the new bipartisan infrastructure law and the funding that is coming our way really puts a high value on that. But I'm going to turn it over to Kiersten to talk a little bit about sort of the grants and what we have to look forward to over the next coming years.
Yeah. Shane mentioned opportunity and, the level of funding that we have under the bipartisan infrastructure law is a huge opportunity for communities to take advantage of. Over the next 5 years, over the next 4 years, we're in year 2 of 5 currently. So we've already started to see some of the impact of these funds. Just about a month ago, it was announced that Kentucky received $7.9 million in EPA Brownfield funding for both assessment, cleanup, and actually 2 revolving loan funds got supplemental funding. And that's more than we've ever seen before, and maybe more than we'll ever see again in our lifetime for Brownfield funding. We got 4 cleanup grants this past cycle, which is more than we've ever gotten. And I think, we're just going to continue to see the benefits that this funding has over the next couple of years. And even beyond that, once these projects really get off the ground and get moving. But yeah, these are funding that's for assessing and cleaning up brownfield properties. There's significantly higher levels of funding, not just the amount of grants that are available, but higher amounts. So maybe cleanup projects that weren't previously feasible are now going to be feasible under this funding. So now is the time to kind of sit down and reevaluate and prioritize these sites. I want to say that there is an emphasis to EPA and to us for these to be community-led revitalization efforts, and there is a heavy focus on targeting underserved communities and new applicants, people that have not been touched by brownfield dollars yet. And we saw the results of that again in the funding that was just awarded.
Awesome. And one thing I just want to sort of share with all of the participants today is if your community hasn't been engaged in the Brownfield program or been in contact with the Brownfield staff and you're interested in it, considering that there is a focus on sort of targeting new communities and applicants, we invite you to reach out to us because this is the opportunity to get your community and get you involved in this process. But really, let's sort of define a brownfield, because sometimes people are really confused about what exactly a brownfield is, or a little nervous. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to sort of help us better understand exactly what a brownfield is.
Sure. In legal terms, brownfields are defined in federal and state laws. EPA in federal law defines it as real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances. So that is EPA's definition for this. We also have state laws that define brownfields, and pretty much they mirror what the federal laws go by. And really, though, the importance of these definitions is that they play into what kinds of properties and who is eligible for the benefits that these programs offer. And by benefits, I mean technical assistance, financial assistance, being able to obtain free assessments. Local governments, for example, can get free environmental site assessments through this program. But these definitions, though, kind of help create the framework of the program that then provides these services. So the legalese is kind of complicated and dry, but it's important in that it does play into who's eligible and what types of properties are eligible.
Thank you. And one thing that we may be using slightly interchangeable today is brownfields as a term both to define the program that Lynn just described, that all of the technical assistance and support, but we may also use the word to describe this physical site, the building or the location or the land. Lynn, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, the simple definition really is just that brownfields are properties that are abandoned, underutilized, they're blighted. These are all terms that we've been using all along. And typically they're commercial or industrial properties, but not always. But the one thing they all have in common is that they are difficult to sell and they're difficult to redevelop because of the concerns with contamination. As mentioned earlier, these sites may or may not be contaminated. Sometimes a brownfield might even be confused with a Superfund site. Now, they're distinctly different from a Superfund site with respect to environmental risk. While Superfund sites are heavily contaminated, brownfields are not quite as contaminated. They're easier to clean up. Remediation is not quite as involved. They typically don't require federal government intervention in trying to get these sites cleaned up. And so it's more feasible to have these types of properties redeveloped than a Superfund site. Superfund sites are with us long-term and they pose serious risks to human health. But brownfields, typically you find petroleum contamination, you might find lead, asbestos. These are the types of contaminants that we find on brownfield sites. In terms of the program, yes, it's been around since brownfield programs have been around actually at the local, state, and federal level since the early 2000s, and they did result out of that brownfield law in 2002. And Kiersten's correct in also explaining that this is the first time in the history of this program that we have had this amount of funding available to do something about these properties. So that is why it's very important for local officials to take note of these funding opportunities right now and to try to identify the properties that they can try to get this funding to resolve for their communities. The main tools for the program are, we've already kind of touched upon, financial, technical assistance, and then liability protections, but we'll get into that a little bit further down the road.
So we've mentioned properties, right? And I think sometimes it's hard to conceptualize, like what could be a potentially contaminated property when we may be driving by them all the time. Lynn or Kiersten, can you sort of share or point out some of the types of properties that folks may be seeing that are actually brownfields that they may be able to leverage some of the programs and technical assistance we're going to be sharing today?
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes when we go into communities and start to explain our program, it doesn't really click. It's like, oh, we don't really have any of those. We don't. And then once you get into this, the specifics of what those properties might be, then it's like, oh yeah, we do have that. And every community has brownfield properties in both rural and urban areas. So brownfield properties are anything from empty buildings that have asbestos, lead, other hazardous materials, abandoned gas stations or former dry cleaners are especially contaminated. Those are ones that we see a lot. Any former industries or factories, old rail yards, any kind of vacated lots and open fields. So it doesn't have to be an actual structure to be considered a brownfield property. And then old schools and hospitals, we see those all the time.
Great, thank you. And then, the big question is, well, what can we do with all of those brownfields? All of those sites have a potential for something. And I'm going to let you sort of share some of what we've seen brownfields be utilized for.
Yeah, I mean, brownfields can be redeveloped into opportunities that clean up the environment, that boost the local economy, that build a stronger community. And, people that invest in brownfields can be anyone from private developers to local governments and nonprofits, and, come together through public-private partnerships a lot of times. But those, brownfields, a lot of times we see a lot of community spaces, community gardens and farmers markets at those locations. Anytime you see, for an example, the Owensboro Riverfront had a lot of brownfield properties. So that is now filled with a lot of entertainment and restaurants, mixed use developments. And, brownfields can even be turned into residential housing, remodeled buildings that have energy efficient features. I mean, there's just a lot of possibilities when it comes to the end use of a brownfield property.
So thank you. And with all of those opportunities comes a lot of benefits for communities. And when we're thinking about the broad benefits of community, as we redevelop these blighted or potentially contaminated buildings and sites, really what we're talking about is improving the overall economic and environmental health, right? We're providing opportunities, whether it be for new businesses or new housing or new sort of tax bases to help facilitate job growth. But the one thing that is interesting to take note about most brownfields is that historically they are very low. They're located very, very close to existing infrastructure. So it allows us to practice infill development that often prevents sprawl, and in particular for communities that are trying to protect those natural spaces that are green spaces around their communities. But the other thing is redeveloping brownfields gives our communities and our leaders an opportunity really to approach social equity and environmental justice in new ways, to really kind of approach that directly, because what we know is that over history, sort of through that development history over time, many of these contaminated sites or polluting sites have been located near populations and in communities that are disadvantaged and have continued to be disadvantaged because of their adjacency to these sites. But there are benefits not just for the communities, but for the developers and investors and folks on the business side of these sites. And let's not get lost here that many of these redevelopment processes do require some capital investments. And to turn these properties into great things, we see a lot of public-private partnerships that often bring private developers to the table. And the reason that they may come to the table is often these properties have a reduced price, or there's potential for new tax incentives for the redevelopment. Like I said, they're usually in really prime locations with existing infrastructure. Typically, communities can provide some favorable zoning or land use provisions for reuse options. And then it also provides opportunities to gather public support and create additional partnerships. Because really, like we mentioned earlier, when we think about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the focus, we really are thinking about and focusing on community-led revitalization efforts and priorities. But who is involved? That's a big process, and who can be involved? Well, as you can see from this slide, really anybody. Stakeholders are broad. But these are the few that I want to highlight here just momentarily. So obviously the property owners, whether that's a public entity or a private entity, the property owner is a critical component in a brownfield redevelopment process. Many of the programs have to be approved by the property owner. For example, if we come and do a site visit to look at these properties, we can't access those properties without their consent. So the owners are obviously critical to this piece, but also the potential buyers, whether that be for new real estate redevelopment or private equity or industrial builders. These are folks who are really looking to maximize their investment, whether that be for their own profits later down the line, or if it's just for creating the impact that they know the community is invested in seeing. We also have a lot of public sector stakeholders that are involved. We're talking local governments, county governments, state governments, obviously with our staff today on the call, but also the federal government. Tons of nonprofits get involved, whether we're talking about food-based nonprofits or community development organizations, philanthropic organizations, neighborhood groups, community groups, but also those quasi-governmental entities like our area development districts. And I'll come back to this later, but our next webinar next month, we're going to be featuring a number of area development district staff talking about how they work with the Brownfield program to leverage that for development in their communities. But we also lots of other parties involved here. And really what I want to emphasize is that these stakeholders in brownfield redevelopment are broad. Really anyone that could be touched by this, by both the existing building, but may be impacted or may benefit from the future use of that building, are invited to the table to help contribute to the redevelopment process. But you may be asking yourself, what exactly does that redevelopment process look like? And this is really kind of a simple sketch of sort of how we visualize that. But before I get into that, I want to remind you that not only is the Brownfield program an opportunity to remediate or mitigate contaminated buildings, but I also want you to think of it as a redevelopment tool, something to put in your toolkit that you can integrate into your broader redevelopment or revitalization strategies, because maybe not every building is a brownfield or an applicable site for the Brownfield program. But what I want to share is that the process that you may go through to engage your community or identify and assess those sites and start to create those redevelopment plans based on community priorities are most certainly valuable to your broader revitalization efforts. It provides sort of a leadway and a structure for you to approach a lot of different types of redevelopment, in particular in downtown revitalization. But it often starts with engaging those stakeholders, right? Your community, that whole list that we were talking about. And the reason this is important, and what I should say is that while it was at the beginning of the process, that isn't the only place this should take place. It really should fall within all of those elements and be peppered through the entire redevelopment process. And the reason this is important is it often drives success. Excuse me. It creates a long-term vision. It often helps sort of curate ownership of what results from it. And you know, it's easy to understand that a project that has public ownership and support from the beginning, it's easy to see how that could have long-term success in perpetuity. But what we really want is we want the resulting use of that building or site to truly reflect the needs of the community as they see it. And one of the benefits is that this often helps establish the team, that committed core folks or core of folks who are willing to move the effort forward. Now, there are lots of different ways to engage community. And one of the things that I want to offer is that if you're thinking about, you know, how do I have these conversations? That is certainly one of the things that we can help you with, whether it be coaching or just sort of talking through opportunities. They come in a variety of ways. Some are more formal that you may be familiar with, like public forums or meetings that that are a little more formal or stuffy, but there's also a lot of really creative, informal ways to engage communities. And those are really represented in the pictures that you see on the right side of the slide. We've got some photo affinity work going on where community members literally vote on the images that they're attracted to or that they find appealing. It really helps sort of curate a design aesthetic that communities desire, but also things as simple as our Chalk and Talk, a mobile chalkboard that allows community members to share in real time their visions and desires for the future. So, these are just a couple examples of some really creative ways to engage communities. But if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out to us. The next step after we've started to engage communities really involves identifying and assessing the sites. Now, again, this can be a community engagement opportunity. And in fact, I want to draw attention to this 2019 map of Harlan in Eastern Kentucky. That really was a community engaged project where together a small group really walked the downtown corridors of Harlan and began mapping vacant buildings. So you can see there all of those red buildings they noted as being vacant. The green buildings had an active or occupied use, and they were really able to use this map to start to direct investment, to seek out a variety of grants, but also work with those building owners to help transition from vacant to occupied uses. And if I'm not mistaken, since then, in the last 4 years, the majority of those vacant buildings now have an active use, and it is nearly impossible to find a building available in downtown Harlan. But what we begin to do with these maps is we start to sort of prioritize what interventions we may want to implement based on all of that community input that we've received up to that point. But the other thing that we start to do as we're identifying and assessing sites is really the beginnings of the environmental assessment. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to talk a little bit more about the assessments that are available through the Brownfield program as we start to inventory and identify the sites that you all may be interested in approaching.
Yeah, well, environmental site assessments are basically studies on the particular piece of property. And they're commonly referred to as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. These studies are done in phases, and they're done progressively, with each phase kind of gathering and collecting more detailed information about that property, all with the intent of trying to determine whether or not the site is contaminated, and if it is contaminated, what types of contaminants are present, and then to what extent that contamination is present as well. So yeah, these are known as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. In a phase 1, this is the preliminary assessment. This would be the first study that's conducted, and we'll talk a little more again, but this is a service that our program provides at the state level. We do provide to local governments and nonprofit organizations and quasi-governmental agencies who are trying to find out whether or not a property in their area is in fact contaminated. It involves a records review. Phase 1 also involves a site inspection, and it even involves interviews with people who are familiar with the property or the historic uses of that property. Phase 1s, once they're completed, once an assessment is completed for phase 1, a report will be written to the effect of what the findings are. If phase 1 findings are revealed that there is potential contamination, for example, in the 1950s, there was known to be a gas station or a service station located in that area. Then that would be an indication that there might be some petroleum contamination. And if that's the case, then further investigation will be needed, and that will go into the phase 2, which will require sampling. If after the phase 1, the findings indicate that there's really no evidence or no indication that there would be any contamination, then really kind of the process stops there. And the local government can go ahead and try to market and redevelop that piece of property. So again, it's all done in a progressive steps, just trying to find out whether or not there is in fact a contamination issue with that site. The phase 2, again, we talked about, does involve sampling. And then a phase 3 takes that sampling just a little further and in fact determines to what extent it's a full site characterization. But what that does is it determines, like, if there is a plume of contaminants in the underground water resources, for example, this phase 3 will determine just how far that plume spreads. In fact, maybe even off site of the property and that is being assessed. So those are what goes on. That is what goes on within these studies. I do want to point out that the significance of the phase 1 is critical, because for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, anyone, regardless if you're local government or just private citizen, anyone that's going to think about or purchasing or acquiring a piece of property, especially a commercial or a former industrial property, needs to have a phase 1 conducted first. And for the reason that a phase 1 will help establish whether or not the contamination is possible, and it will also help establish for that prospective purchaser that they did not cause that contamination. If contamination is found on the site, then obviously it was done prior to the purchase of that site. And lenders typically don't even lend any money for the purchase of these properties until a phase 1 is conducted. In terms of our program, a phase 1 is important because it's required in order to get cleanup funding. So for a lot of reasons, it's critical to look into it and to have that done on a property before it's purchased or acquired.
Thank you, Lynn. And the one thing I always like to sort of emphasize here is that phase 1 really is no different than the due diligence that someone may do when they're purchasing a home. If they're testing it for radon, or if they're testing it for termites, this really is sort of part of what a good due diligence practice should be when these properties are being transferred in community.
Yes, exactly.
But as we move into like the plan, what are we going to do with these sites? We've engaged our communities. We've created the vision. We know what their priorities for reuse are. We've begun to sort of get a sense of the assessments, what the findings are. But there is a whole sort of scientific and technical feasibility that comes out. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to talk a little bit more about that.
Right. Well, when a site is found to have contamination issues, then there are a lot of things that must be considered in terms of, how to go forward with the cleanup process. Basically, you need to kind of there's 2 categories that you'll want to kind of weigh the options in, one being, what the technical requirements are, and the other being what the financial requirements are. For example, technical considerations would include, what is the intended use of that property, or what, at this stage of the game anyway, what does the potential buyer want to do with that property once it is cleaned up? Because whatever the end use is going to be for that piece of for that particular brownfield property is going to determine what level of cleanup is needed. Other considerations are, can the purchaser possibly obtain liability protections? Liability protections will protect that property owner from being held responsible for pre-existing contamination. So again, that's where this phase 1 plays in, and why it is so important to have that done, especially for someone wanting to purchase these and redevelop these sites, so that they don't end up being on the hook for the costs associated with the cleanup and further investigations of that site. Liability protections are offered as well through Kentucky Brownfield Redevelopment programs, and that's something that we can certainly provide some guidance on, helping a local entity pursue if they would like to try to get a piece of the property and get it redeveloped, without obviously assuming the responsibility for the contamination. The other considerations to keep in mind are the financial considerations, the costs of the cleanup. So, perhaps you wanted that property to be of residential use, but the level of cleanup is going to be more extensive for a site that's going to be turned into a residence. So it may not be financially feasible to pursue the end use as a residential site if it's going to be too costly. So these are just the kind of things that go into the thought process once you really get into the point where you need to clean it up and redevelop it for whatever use it's going to be.
Thank you, Lynn. And one of the questions we get quite often is, well, how clean is clean enough? And
Yeah.
and I want to sort of double down here a little bit on what Lynn was saying and let her explain this, but really it is based on that sort of end use. And that's really why that community engagement and vision and priority uses should sort of help lead the conversation. And then those feasibility, financial, and liability questions help kind of filter the type of cleanup that may be required. But Lynn, I'm going to let you sort of describe a little bit more about, how clean is clean enough when we're focusing on these properties.
Right. Well, basically in remediating brownfields, there's two types of cleanups, and that's complete cleanup and a risk-based cleanup. A complete cleanup, as you can imagine, results in removing all the contamination almost to a pristine condition. Well, actually, complete removal of any type of contamination. As you can imagine, that's going to be or could be very costly, and it could be an extensive amount of cleanup activity involved. A risk-based cleanup, which is far more the norm for a brownfield property, focuses on reducing the risk by using techniques to remove some of the contaminants, or even to allow some of the contaminants to remain in place. Capping, for example, is a common way to contain petroleum,
for example.
If there's a site that has some issues with that, you can actually just cap it with use it as a parking lot, or for some purpose that obviously the soil underneath the cap is not going to be disturbed. So what you're doing basically is minimizing or reducing the risk of exposure to anyone, not necessarily needing to remediate or remove all of the contaminated soil, but instead containing it. So while most brownfield cleanups are risk-based, the level of cleanup will depend on how it's reused. You can kind of see in this graphic kind of the spectrum of cleanup activities, and with residential type of properties, if it's going to be reused for that purpose, then obviously you're going to have people that are that could potentially be more exposed to whatever is in the environment there. So again, more extensive cleanup required. If, for example, the property is going to be used for industrial purposes, and a lot of times within industry, there are going to be institutional controls in place and other controls in place anyway to kind of mitigate or reduce exposure risk, then you wouldn't need as extensive a cleanup, because again, it's just really all about how much a person could potentially be exposed to what's there.
Thank you, Lynn. And as we're discussing cleanup options, I'm assuming that many of the attendees are thinking, "Oh, that sounds really expensive." And you're probably right. And that's why we are so excited about this new funding stream coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law. But I'm going to turn it over to Kiersten to talk a little bit about some of the funding opportunities and other financial support that you may be able to access through existing programs here in the state.
Yeah, I will say that, we have funding opportunities at the state level and at, the federal EPA Brownfield Program level. I'm going to just hit very quickly on the types of funding that EPA Brownfield Program offers really quick, and then we'll talk some about what the state offers as well. But essentially what you're looking at when you go to apply for any assessment or cleanup funding through EPA is first of all, assessment grants. Typically, those are community-wide assessment grants. So a particular corridor or region or, couple streets of your community that you have a lot of brownfield properties that you want those assessment activities performed at. So like Lynn mentioned, those would include phase 1s, phase 2s, also a document that we call an analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, which just kind of tells you what you may be able to do with that property and for what cost. But assessment grants are a great opportunity because especially if you're just starting out in the brownfield redevelopment world and assessing those properties, because you can use that funding for community engagement activities, for developing inventories, and then also having those assessments performed where, there may not be any issues with some of the properties that you thought were contaminated, and then you are able to better prioritize the sites that might need cleanup funding down the line. Another option, is a cleanup grant, and I will say that you have to be an owner of the property to apply for an EPA cleanup grant. And that's important because you have to have had that phase 1 and done your kind of environmental due diligence before owning the property in order to be eligible for that funding. But cleanup grants right now at the federal level are going in they have 3 levels of funding. I believe it's 500,000, $1 million, and $2 million. And if it's consistent with last year, that's what we anticipate for this year as well. Multi-purpose grants are just kind of a combination of the two. Maybe you want to assess a couple sites in the same general area and also perform a cleanup on one specific location. And then also EPA offers revolving loan funds. So if you wanted to start your own revolving loan fund to be able to loan out or sub-grant EPA funding for cleanup projects, it's only for cleanup projects, not any assessment activities. But we have a revolving loan fund, and that's the only funding source that we really offer at the state level for cleanup projects. But our revolving loan fund is called the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, and we offer 0 to low interest loans for communities that are undertaking cleanup projects. And then there's also what they call a technical assistance to brownfield. You'll hear TAB a lot, and they typically have 1 TAB provider per EPA region. And they offer, for us, they offer a lot of resources and documents about brownfield. It's just a good learning opportunity. They also, I think, host some of the conferences, like one of the national conference this year. I believe one of the TAB providers is a host of. And then lastly, on the federal level is EPA training or job training grants. So funding is available to provide job training for residents that are impacted by brownfield properties in their communities. So those training activities, people, can be trained to support assessment and cleanup activities and preparing for redevelopment in their areas.
Thank you, Kiersten. And one sort of creative thing I just want to draw attention to is, redevelopment processes, we really have to be creative with them. And there is a wonderful story in Jackson County where a substantial building, a historic site was being sort of cleaned up and going through the redevelopment process. And that community was able to leverage their job training grant to train individuals on historic window restoration, right? You can imagine that being not just an expensive process in a building revitalization effort, but also one that is critical when we're thinking about lead or asbestos paint and things like that. But these programs can really be leveraged in ways that are quite creative. But these aren't the only opportunities that we have. And I'm going to allow Kiersten to sort of share just a little insight about what we can glean from the Brownfield Federal Program Guide.
Yeah, so funding, brownfield funding as a whole can't be used for any like demolition or construction activities. It's only used for that environmental assessment activities and, the cleanup and remediation of any environmental contaminants. So EPA publishes this document, the Brownfield Federal Programs Guide, biannually, and it just gives you some insight onto where resources are for other kind of portions of your redevelopment project. You can see on the left column, what federal agency it is, and then what they might be able to provide at kind of what stage in the process that you're in. There's area-wide planning grants from some people. There's, a lot of money out there for housing and infrastructure right now. So it's definitely worth taking a look at as you're kind of looking at options for how to fund your project as a whole. And, Shane's going to talk a little bit more about the investment that it takes, or the investment that it is to roll into these redevelopment projects.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add here is that what you see on the left is really just a screenshot of one page. The program guide, there are probably 5 to 7, 8 pages of different federal agencies' funding sources that play well with brownfield funding, because if you've messed with federal funding, sometimes they don't always play well together, but this guide really aggregates all of those sources that do play well together. But the thing that I really want to emphasize here is that when local investments are sort of from municipalities or those nonprofits or even philanthropic organizations are the first investments, it really demonstrates that there is a commitment at the local level to support these things, because just like any other business development or big investment, no one wants to take the risk of being the only investor, right? And in particular, government sources do not like being the only party in the investment portfolio. So sometimes it is within, it really pays dividends, honestly, for some of these early investments to come from the local community or the local government, local nonprofits, or your local philanthropies. Even if they are small investments related to that redevelopment process to get things moving, it shows a real local commitment to the effort and to the broader investment strategy that you're going to have to make to move some of these projects and sites forward. It's really important to kind of have some skin in the game, as they say. But, after funding has sort of came through and you're thinking about, implementing, there are a lot of great success stories about projects that have been implemented. And I'm going to turn it over to Kiersten to kind of point out a few of those.
Yeah, I'm relatively new to the program, so there's not a lot, I haven't seen a lot of start to finish projects yet, but I will say that, our previous Brownfield coordinator, somebody that was really involved in Brownfield for a long time, Amanda Lefevre, some of you might recognize her name. One of the first projects that she worked on in this program was the Hayeswood Hospital in Maysville. And they, were trying to figure out redevelopment options for a really long time. And as you can imagine, over time, the blight gets worse, the contamination and the hazards and the, just the building itself gets worse. And so we were really, really, really excited to hear that this past cycle, they were awarded with a $2 million cleanup grant to be able to revitalize that property and take care of all the contamination issues. But that's a really large scale project. We have a lot of small scale projects that are equally as impactful for that individual community as some of those bigger projects. So you can see in the middle there, just even as something as simple as a community space, playground, something like that on top of an old, what used to be a blighted, vacant building is something that is an investment for the community. And yeah, so over here, this photo collage just shows kind of everything that's that's involved in implementing this whole plan. From the building itself to doing those environmental site assessments, the planning that's involved on the front end, and then the community engagement and the big check ceremony, and that's kind of when the real work begins. So
awesome, thank you. And I know folks are probably thinking, whew, this sounds like a lot. This, we're going to be engaging community. We're doing assessments. We're creating plans. We've got to fund this plan. And then lastly, we're going to implement it. But what I want to remind you is that there are lots of support available. And really, this is an invitation to you all to receive some of that support. But I'm going to allow Kiersten to sort of share, and we're going to touch on some available technical assistance in our next slide. But mind sharing with folks sort of what is available at the state level?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give you a quick snapshot of kind of what our program is about. We offer no cost environmental site assessments to all those eligible entities that we talked about earlier. So local governments, nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofits, and quasi-governmental agencies. We offer grant writing assistance in the forms of, grant writing workshops and that kind of thing to communities. We also have our CCF, the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, which is our revolving loan program. We have a couple technical assistance options that Lynn's going to touch on in the next slide. And then overall, kind of what I do is the community outreach and planning and what we're doing through our partnership with SEDIC. So yeah, I'll let Lynn take it from here.
Right, as Kiersten mentioned, target assessments are one of the primary ways that we do help local communities. We offer phase 1s, phase 2s. We can also offer ABCAs, which Kiersten touched upon earlier, the analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives. These services are totally free to local governments if there's access to the property, if the property owner permits us to get onto their property and do these studies, then yes, they're totally free to the local government. And really, it's a savings to the extent of thousands of dollars, because otherwise, hiring a private environmental consultant to do this type of work could range, even the most basic assessment might be $2,000 or $3,000, and then a full site characterization, a phase 3, for example, could be in the hundreds of thousands. So it could be a big savings. We do some of these assessments in-house, and then we also contract them out. We have consultants on price contract, and I will also say this is all at the state level, but at the federal level, they have a similar targeted brownfield assessment program that they also run, very similar to how ours is run. I will say the application process through our program is quicker, and there's probably a faster turnaround with it. And you don't have to think in terms of a huge piece of property or a factory or something like that. This could be just a mom and pop gas station down the road that simply needs a phase 1 conducted on it. So as Kiersten was also talking, we do a lot of support for EPA and their grant program. We do have funding available through our loan. However, EPA has funding available in much larger amounts, so much more significant awards can be sought after through EPA, such as that Hayeswood Hospital award that recently got $2 million, that was a very big win for Kentucky. We do provide letters of support to communities that are seeking these grants. That's actually a required part of their application process. Part of their grant proposal is required to have that. And we will also review drafts of grant proposals and just work with communities one-on-one on what types of things that they might want to put into their proposal. We offer workshops, and in terms of technical assistance, we work with our staff in the Division of Waste Management with respect to liability protection programs that those are set up to encourage people to purchase contaminated pieces of property, but know that they are not going to be held responsible for cleanup and investigation of that site. Along with these liability protections, we can offer some assistance with reuse planning in the application process for liability protections. And the entity is required to submit a property management plan, and that is something that our staff with the Division of Waste Management review and can provide some guidance on too. So if anyone is interested in applying for some of these services, just contact us and we can certainly help you get started.
Great. Thank you. And I just want to remind folks, I want to do a quick time check. We're getting to the end of the hour. We are on our second to last slide. We're almost there, but I just want to remind folks, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box. Even after the presentation, if we go over a little time, we're going to stay on and answer those so that they will be captured in the recording of this webinar that you'll be receiving. So please, if you have questions, please add those in the Q&A and we'll circle back to those after the next slide here. But the other piece, the less technical piece that I want to sort of talk about with Kiersten is sort of our passion, and that's that education and outreach. It's things like this webinar, sharing stories and trying to provide some more insight. Most certainly if there are sites that you're interested in, but just aren't quite sure and you want a site visit, we can come to your community and visit. Take a look and have those conversations around what may be the next steps. If you're really interested in sort of how we engage our community or how we may think about some of this visioning and stakeholder engagement, we can also sort of support you with that. We can do some community coaching and sort of talk through the preliminary steps and even provide resources around conducting that planning and community engagement. But you know, we have to hear from you. We don't know, we're not clairvoyant. So if there is an opportunity that you even are thinking about or considering, I want to invite you to reach out to us so that we can get involved and start that conversation with you. Kiersten, is there anything that you'd like to add to sort of the outreach and education component here?
The only thing I want to say is that we're relatively, you know, this is our first year in our partnership together, you know, and we're open to ideas. So if there's other resources in addition to some of these that you see on the right-hand side that you would like to see, that we have an opportunity to develop those over the next couple of years. So again, feel free to reach out.
That's a great point. And just to emphasize, so if there's something that we haven't touched on today that you're really interested in learning more about, let us know. And we're excited to really provide the sort of support that you all need as you're facing these planning obstacles in your community. But there are a bunch of other resources out there that we can certainly direct you to. And Kiersten, would you like to sort of point out any of these that special interest?
Yeah, so our website obviously is on the top of the page. We're also very, very close to publishing a GIS hub resource that's kind of a intro to brownfields, you know, something that's more navigable than what you would see on a typical state website. You know, we're trying to get resources out there to people, again, you know, underserved communities that have not had access to brownfield funding before. So keep an eye out for that. We're going to be pushing that out, you know, in both of our newsletters, and it'll be linked on our website. Also, you know, there are multiple resources for inventorying properties through economic development, through EPA cleanups in my community. And then, yeah, I mean, just EPA's publications, we've got that leveraging guide and the federal programs guide. Those are just some to take a look at if you have the time. You know, that's just, we wanted you all to have those on here.
There are a lot of resources. Once you start searching, sometimes it's a little too much sometimes, but and if you find yourself in that, please reach out and we may be able to sort of parse through some of it. But one thing that I want to plug is some of our upcoming webinars before we get to our question and answers. So next month, we're going to be really focusing on sort of blight to bright, with a panel of area development district staff who focus really on brownfield redevelopment. And we're going to be hearing from them about how they connect with their community and some of the projects they're working on. Our August webinar is going to be really focused on the revitalization long game and how the city of Beattyville in Lee County has leveraged a recent or are planning to leverage a recent almost $500,000 cleanup grant that was just recently announced, and how it fits within a 15-year arc of their redevelopment and revitalization effort in the city of Beattyville. So I invite you to join us for either of those. We will be recording those and getting those out. But before we get too far past 2 o'clock, it's time for some questions and answers. I want to make sure you have our emails there in case you would like to reach out to us. Please reach out with any questions or comments that you may have. But I'm gonna stop the presentation and pull up the questions here. So it looks like let's see here. We've got an appreciation and a reintroduction. Thank you for putting this together. Someone letting us know that the chat box was disabled. I apologize for that. We'll make sure that the chat box is available for our next presentation. But then our question here from Shelley is, how do you know if your area has received this funding in the past? That's a great question.
So probably the easiest way for you to see what areas have been funded in the past is going to EPA cleanups in my community. You can filter a bunch of different ways, but if you just filter down to even just the state, you can see a pretty wide range of, where projects have been funded or where brownfield funding has been used. I believe that filters down to like where assessments have been performed and who has received funding as well. So, but if you have any, also on the GIS hub that we're about to publish, that'll have information from EPA cleanups in my community as well. And our GIS specialist, Ben Applegate, has also developed kind of a where Kentucky has received brownfield funding map as well. So we're excited about that.
Thank you. Diane shared, she wanted to see our contact information again. So I've gone ahead and I've shared our contact information. I have all of your email addresses from when you registered. So after we get the webinar sort of published on our YouTube channel, I will make sure to send that out to everybody that was registered. You'll get the link, and I will also make sure to include our contact information as well as a part of that email. But as we wrap up here, I just want to extend one last invitation to all of you out there, whether you're with us today or watching this as a YouTube video after the recording. If you have additional questions, if you are interested in additional resources, or if you just want to sort of brainstorm and troubleshoot around vacant, derelict, or blighted properties in your community, please reach out to us. And let us get the conversation started to see what resources we may be able to bring to bear as a part of the Brownfield program or through our partnership, thinking about how can we start to move and get more of this money really in communities that need it to move these projects forward. And with that said, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to thank our guests, Lynn and Kiersten. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And for sharing. And again, I look forward to hearing from all of you out there who may be watching this as we really get started moving forward, thinking about the best ways we can support you to address these community issues and get people involved in creating solutions that are most appropriate for your community. So thank you. Have a great day. And I'm sure we will hear from you, I hope. Take care.